Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
Much for sticking around through our keynote. I'm glad that you guys are all able to see the lovely Miss V talk about her amazing, incredibly resilient survivor story and hear the advice that she had to share with you and the youth. You guys have not seen my face yet, but my name is Jen Jayanthan, and I am the coordinator of dating violence prevention over at Partnership Against Domestic Violence. And it is my honor to every single day work with young people, teenagers, and even adults on making sure that you guys have the protections that you need and the safety mechanisms you need and the prevention skills you need to end teen dating violence in our communities. I am so incredibly excited about this workshop that you guys are about to witness. The lovely Mary Koneig is joining us today from the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation, which is a really amazing nonprofit that provides housing aid and legal advocacy services to intimate partner violence and low-income families. Mary will be talking to you guys today about intimate partner abuse in LGBTQ communities and how every single one of you guys can be the best allies possible if you have a friend that identifies as being queer or anything else on the lovely rainbow spectrum comes to you saying that they are now the victim of dating violence. So Mary, please take it away.
Thanks, Jen. Hey, everybody, and thanks so much to all of you for being here on a Saturday to have all these really important discussions. And thanks to ADV for inviting me and just being such great partners to AVLF. So I was hoping to have a discussion today, like Jen said, about intimate partner abuse in LGBTQ communities and how we can make all of our communities safe for everyone, regardless of their gender identity or sexual identity. And like Jen said, my name's Mary. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I work with the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation. I've also included my coworker Akshaya on these slides since they helped put these slides together, but unfortunately they couldn't be here today. But I'm going to be presenting some information that they helped put together. So most of my job involves helping people who are survivors of violence connect to resources and supports to help them as they work toward safety and stability after leaving an abusive relationship and filing for a temporary protective order in the office that I work in the Fulton County Courthouse. Before working at AVLF, I was doing a lot of research on intimate partner abuse and the sorts of relationships that it can happen in. And through that research and through my work working directly with survivors as a social worker, I've seen just how incredibly important it is that we all acknowledge that there is sexual and gender diversity in the people who experience abuse, and that our efforts to prevent and address abuse and dating violence have to work for everybody, regardless of how they identify. So today I thought we could have a discussion about how we can make our communities safer for people of all gender and sexual identities. Y'all are the experts on the communities that you're in, whether it is a school, a different group that you're in, a friend group, you're the expert on that. So I definitely want to hear from y'all and your expertise because I have a feeling that you have a lot. So if you I guess you can type in the session chat by tabbing over to session. And throughout these slides, please feel free to chime in if you have any questions or comments, or if you have any knowledge on this topic that you would like to share. I would love for us all to be able to benefit from it. Okay. So just an overview, thinking about dating violence or about LGBTQIA identities might be a topic that you're already really familiar with, or it might be something that you don't have a ton of experience with yet. Regardless, we know that sexual and gender minority folks do experience abuse. So it's important to know some basic terms and definitions, myths and facts and things like that, as we're starting to have a conversation about how we can make our communities safer. So regardless of where we're at now, I'm hoping that we could all end understanding than what we started with and maybe brainstorm some ideas together. So we'll start with some terms and definitions just to make sure we're all sort of working from the same page, and then discuss some myths and facts about LGBTQIA partner abuse. And then we'll have sort of a brainstorming discussion about, so what can we do about it? Now that we have a little bit more information about what violence might look like in these communities, what actions can we take from this session out into our lives, whether it's something that we do as individuals or something that we get groups of folks together to work on with us. So like I said, throughout the session, please type in the chat if you have anything to add or any questions. And I just want to give a heads up that I know this was mentioned this morning, but just to say it again, we are going to cover some things that are pretty heavy. So if anybody needs to step away for a minute, that's totally okay. And you can also contact, I think it was pinned in the event tab, you can contact PADV. Okay, so just to start with some definitions, these are just from one resource that and because language around identity is always changing and evolving, other resources might define things a little bit differently, and that's okay. But what I liked about this one is that it has sort of 4 different categories that they conceptualize as something that could be related in people's lives or they could not be related. So the first they covered is gender identity, which refers to how you in your head think about yourself, so how you interpret your gender. And a lot of words might come to mind when you think about who you are. Not all of them are related to gender. The ones that are would refer to your gender identity. So for example, you might identify as a woman, as a man, you might identify as a non-binary person or a gender non-conforming person, or anything else. And then gender expression is then what the rest of the world sees. So how you would demonstrate your gender through the ways that you act, dress, interact with other people, your mannerisms, based on society's idea about gender roles. So that could be more stereotypically feminine, more masculine, kind of androgynous, or anywhere in between. And this can change from day to day. And then biological sex refers to what's usually assigned at birth by a doctor. So doctors would look at organs, hormones, chromosomes, and then assign a sex at birth. And in the US right now, the categories that are typically used are female, male, and intersex, although there have been different categories in different times and different places used. And then finally, sexual orientation is, oh, thanks, Vera. Vera said, I love that you said this can change day to day, and that's totally true. Some days you're feeling like a little bit more on the feminine end of the spectrum, other days that changes. So sexual orientation refers to who you're attracted to. So based on that person's gender as it relates to your own. So that's physical, spiritual, emotional, anything else. Words that you might have heard people use to describe this part of their identity would be things like gay, straight, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, queer, asexual, or you might have heard some different ones. We'll also use these words in this session, transgender and cisgender. And y'all have probably heard people say transgender. Fewer people have heard the word cisgender. So transgender is the identity that might be claimed by people whose self-identified gender identity doesn't align with the sex that they were assigned at birth by a doctor. And there are no requirements to being transgender other than identifying that way. So some transgender people certainly undergo a surgery or other methods of changing their physical appearance to match their identity, but other transgender people don't. And those are all legitimately transgender people. There's no requirements. And then cisgender describes people whose self-identified gender aligns with either conventional notions of male or female gender or their sex that was assigned at birth. And you might have also heard the word queer. It's often used as a political or identity term that's been reclaimed by many people. or it can be used as sort of an umbrella term that represents someone who doesn't identify as straight or cisgender, but also doesn't really feel like the categories like gay or lesbian or other common categories really fit. So you might also come across people who still find the word derogatory. So like many other terms that people might use to describe themselves, you can always wait until someone uses a word to describe themselves or their experiences and use that word that they use, or you can ask is it okay if I call you this? Who is it okay for me to tell? Who already knows about this? And just have a respectful conversation with somebody about it. Other terms that are really important to know when we're thinking about especially violence and abuse in this community are heterosexism and transphobia. So heterosexism is the societal and institutional privileging of heterosexuality as a normal or best way. So that's kind of a lot of like fancy words to say it's the assumption that either everyone is straight or everyone should be straight. And if you're not, then there's somehow something wrong with that. Transphobia refers to prejudice against transgender people or people who don't conform to the notions of gender that you think are the right ones, and the societal and institutional privileging of cisgender as the best or only normal way. So either that everyone is cisgender or that everyone should be. So before moving on, I want to do a quick check-in just to see where everyone is at with some of these terms and definitions. There's no right or wrong answer to this poll, but there should be a poll, I think. Yes, yeah. So if you tab over to the poll section, there's a poll that's titled, "How are you feeling about these definitions and concepts?" And it ranges from totally familiar and comfortable with all of them to just, I have some questions or need more information to understand. I also just saw a question from Samantha asking, is questioning part of the sexual orientation spectrum? And that's a great question. And a lot of folks would define the sexual orientation spectrum in different ways because like we talked about earlier, language and the way that people use words to describe themselves is always changing as people are creating new words and new categories to fit experiences that didn't have a word or category to define them before. So the acronym a lot of y'all may have heard is LGBTQIA. But folks use different acronyms. Some people say sexual and gender minorities just as a sort of umbrella term. And Q in that acronym that's more common sometimes refers to queer, sometimes refers to questioning. Let me know if that answer was getting at sort of what you were asking, Samantha. Thank you, Vera. And Vera also wrote earlier, respectfully ask, and that is completely true. Pretty much every person that I've talked with has said, you know, I'd really rather someone just ask me respectfully rather than accidentally get someone's pronouns wrong, for example. And of course, that's asking respectfully for the information that you really need to know. If it's something that you need to know how to refer to someone, then absolutely. Sometimes it's just something that we're curious about, in which case, you know, if people don't necessarily feel like being a resource, Google is a great resource too. Thank you, Vera. Okay, so I'm seeing the poll results. It looks like the majority of people are saying they're totally familiar and comfortable with the definitions, which is awesome. A good number of folks are also mostly familiar or comfortable with them. And then a few people said they're starting to understand, which is awesome. So if anybody has any questions about that moving forward, even if it's something that comes up later, please feel free to type it in the chat too. But for now, we can move on to talk specifically about the way that intimate partner abuse can operate in different sorts of sexual and gender communities. So what do you all think most people picture when they think about a victim of abuse and a perpetrator of abuse? Or what's the image that is most often seen on TV or in movies? And you can type answers to that in the chat. Yeah, Vera said, I think most people picture a man abusing a woman. And I have had a conversation about this same topic. Yeah, Samantha said abusers most often depicted as men. Some people are saying ditto, and that is the answer that I get immediately every time I ask this question in a similar conversation. So most people picture the same thing. And I want to say that it's true that this does happen often. That situation does happen often, but we also know that it doesn't cover everyone's experiences, right? So the problem with that is that it can lead to some issues down the line for LGBTQ folks, and some myths about LGBTQ abuse. So it can lead to things like the perception that women can't be violent or dangerous toward each other or toward anyone else. It can lead to the myth that violence in a relationship between two more masculine people is just like boys being boys, or just fighting it out, or somehow normal, which is very false. I totally agree, Samantha. And then this results in violence between two people of similar genders not being taken seriously, since a lot of people believe that abuse is mutual or somehow evenly matched, or that power is evenly matched in situations where people's gender is similar. So people might also think that the more masculine partner has to be the abuser, and the more feminine presenting partner is the victim. And that's not always true. And it can lead to some real issues for LGBTQ survivors if they want to involve any sort of social services or any other sort of institution in that, if people don't understand that these are myths. So we already know that the stereotypical image of abuse isn't representative of all experiences. So we know that violence can and does happen in any kind of relationship. And there just hasn't, unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of research done on intimate partner abuse in general, or on LGBTQ intimate partner abuse. So it's hard to know. Aiden, thank you so much for asking that question. I feel like maybe I'm about to answer it, but if I don't answer it, please comment and chime in. So it's hard to know the number of LGBTQ people that experience abuse. It's just because of the lack of research and because of the stigma around talking about it. But studies that have been done indicate that abuse happens at about the same severity and frequency in all different sorts of relationships. So it's about the same severity and frequency in relationships between LGBTQ folks and between straight and cisgender people. When it comes to younger folks, those numbers might be a little higher. So one study that I recently found that surveyed 7th through 12th graders who identified as LGBTQIA reported that 43% of them reported experiencing physical abuse, compared to 29% of heterosexual youth. 59% reported experiencing emotional abuse, compared to 46% of heterosexual youth, and 37% reported experiencing social media or digital abuse and harassment, compared to 26% of heterosexual youth. So that study that I found that it was a little bit more common amongst teens who are LGBTQ, which there could be a lot of different reasons for that. So it's, yeah, same or similar frequency and severity. All of this research tells us that violence knows no gender identity or expression. So you can't really tell based on how somebody looks or other identifying characteristics of them who is a victim abuser. And while the dynamics of abuse work in similar ways in different kinds of relationships, what I found in my research and in my experience as a social worker is that LGBTQ survivors might just have additional things that they have to deal with or additional barriers when they're trying to get help. And that's because of systems like homophobia and transphobia and those myths. Yeah, a lot of folks are chiming in and saying, like, absolutely. Bigotry is another big one. And those sort of systems contribute to the ways that abusive partners can gain power and control, and barriers to reporting and getting help. So y'all might have seen a power and control wheel before. Basically, it illustrates some things that abusive partners might do in order to gain power and control in a relationship. And you'll notice if you can actually read the wheel, which I'm not sure if you can, it might be too small, but it's the LGBTQ power and control wheel if you want to look it up later. But if you could see it, you would notice that a lot of things are the same as what you might see in a relationship that's like a straight relationship. But there are also some additional things to keep in mind. Essentially, abusers or abusive partners are aware that our society is biased against LGBTQ people, and they can use that fact to gain power in a relationship, whether it's using homophobic or transphobic language to emotionally abuse, or controlling how someone presents their gender, or withholding like hormones or other medications somebody would be on, or even threatening to out someone to their family or to their employer if they come forward about the abuse, which can be really powerful if you live somewhere, or if you have a family that doesn't understand, live somewhere that doesn't have protections, that you wouldn't lose your job because of that. Unfortunately, Georgia doesn't have employment discrimination protection specifically for sexual orientation or gender identity. So that can be really powerful because the outed person might lose the support of their family or friends. They might lose their housing if they're living with family, or they might lose their job. And then another thing is that it might be easier if somebody lives in sort of a small community with very few spaces for LGBTQ people to get together and feel safe, then it might be easier to isolate that person because there are already very few spaces that they can go to. And it looks like Vera has pasted a link to the power and control wheel in the chat if anybody wants to look at it. And if you had any questions or comments about that or anything that struck you, feel free to chime in the chat. And because of homophobia and transphobia, it might also be harder for an LGBTQ survivor to speak up and get help. And that's because of some barriers to reporting. So I did a project where I spoke with LGBTQ survivors about their experience coming forward. And one thing that came up a lot more than I thought it would is that a lot of people didn't recognize initially that something was even wrong in their relationship because there isn't a lot of visibility for LGBTQ relationships at all, especially healthy LGBTQ relationships on TV and in movies and in the media. And that's fortunately something that I think is changing, but it's still not really there. So the lack of prominent examples or role models for healthy relationships might make it hard for someone to recognize that their relationship might be unhealthy. And that could be something that the abusive partner kind of exploits. Like they might say, this is how all relationships are. And if anybody tells you that it should be different, it's because they don't understand our relationship and things like that. So that can also mean that lack of visibility can also mean that friends and family might not notice that someone's in an unhealthy relationship because they might actually not know that that person's even in a relationship. So if someone's not out to their family, the family might not even know that they're with anybody, let alone that they're with someone that they might need help getting free from. And then being kind of mistreated in society in general might lead people to believe that they're lucky to even be with somebody at all, which of course we know that nobody ever deserves abuse, but they've been made to feel that they're lucky to find love, even if it is violent. And then one thing we kind of talked about is the small community. So it might be hard to talk about if you depend on a small network of friends, especially if the abusive partner is also a member of that friend group, because people might fear that what they say will come back to the abuser if they tell it to a mutual friend, or they might just fear sort of isolating themselves from that community. People also reported not wanting to come forward about abuse publicly or even talking about it with friends or family because they don't want anyone to think that basically that's how all LGBTQ relationships are. So they don't want people to think that they're all bad or violent, and use that information basically to justify their own prejudice. Especially if a family member has never really been supportive of the relationship, I'm sure you can all imagine how hard it would be to tell that person about abuse. And then we also know, unfortunately, statistically, LGBTQ folks often have worse experiences with institutions like medical staff, courts, law enforcement, social workers. So if anyone has come forward and gotten a bad response in the past from the people who are supposed to help, it might make them less likely to want to keep coming forward in the future. And I do want to say that despite all these barriers, I know that was a lot of heavy information, but there are a lot of people who leave abusive relationships and get help and heal from the experience and are able to have healthy relationships of all kinds in the future. And there are a ton of people doing amazing work to try to prevent violence and support survivors and make their communities safer, including y'all for spending, a couple hours this morning and afternoon talking about this. So thank you for being here. Yeah, Samantha has commented, if you are LGBTQIA phobic, you shouldn't be working as a doctor or officer, at least in my opinion. I have to say that I agree, and I also think that there are a lot of experience, or there are a lot of folks who I've come across who are really open to learning, but who don't know a lot yet. So there are a lot of opportunities for us to sort of reach out to folks and see if we can help share some of our knowledge and things like that. Yeah. Okay. So I just wanted to do a quick check-in on that information. It's the same poll as before. How are you feeling about that information? Are you feeling like you're kind of grasping it, or is a lot of it sort of new to you? Okay. So I don't know if everyone has tabbed over to the polls and then completed the poll, but while we're waiting, oh, I see the results now. Okay. Okay, so it looks like 75% of people are feeling either totally familiar or mostly familiar with them. If there's anything that y'all have specific questions about that can help sort of move you along to feeling like a little bit more familiar, then I'm happy to answer those questions. And it's also totally possible that maybe I didn't explain something in a way that made a lot of sense. So if there was anything that was confusing, that's on me, and I'd love to give it another shot. Okay. So please feel free, if y'all were some of the people who said, I'm totally comfortable and familiar, if there's any information that you want to add from your expertise, I'm happy for us all to benefit from that too. The reminder about isolation from society is powerful. Absolutely. It's something that I think a lot of different survivors of abuse, regardless of sexual or gender identity, can feel that isolation from society, but it can be even more powerful in spaces that are not always as welcoming for LGBTQ folks. Okay. So again, if there are remaining questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. But I'd also like to just hear from you all and have a brainstorming session about what can we do now that we have a little bit more information about this, or that we're thinking about it on a Saturday afternoon. How can we help LGBTQ survivors and make our communities safer for everybody? Whether that's something that we can do right after this summit or on our own, or if it's something that we want to work on getting folks together and doing together. So if y'all have ideas for what we can do, go ahead and type them in the chat. Yeah, Jen said we can work with our school's GSA on outreach events. Absolutely. So schools are a really big place that we can be doing this work, because for a lot of us, that's where, I mean, if you're a teen here, that's where you spend like a lot of your time. Maybe not physically right now, since maybe some people are schooling from home, but that's an environment where if there are things going on that are discriminatory or not welcoming, that's an opportunity to try to knock down some of those systems that hold up the barriers to reporting or hold up the ways that people can abuse. Yeah. Samantha said, learn to accept and love LGBTQIA+ folks in the first place, especially when they decide to come out. Yeah, that's super important. The first couple people that somebody comes out to can really sort of set the tone for how that person feels, and if they feel welcomed. Continue to find ways to share the correct information and provide the best narrative to the story. That is a great idea, Ebony. And I really like that because I've talked with a lot of folks in similar conversations about ways that we can use like our unique talents and interests to help. So a lot of folks think that like you have to be a social worker or you have to be some or other sort of social services professional to help. And that's absolutely not true. I mean, there's a lot of people who, if you are filmmaker. Maybe you want to include more stories about healthy LGBTQ relationships in the art that you make. If you write, then you can write about that. Even if you have like I talked with somebody in one of these conversations that was like a social media influencer, and she was like, I'm going to use my platform to share this information with people, which I thought was really cool. Yeah. Somebody said, Janet said, the first step is to recognize everyone's humanity, and that's absolutely right. And Aiden said, in my high school, we have a GSA. Maybe it could be a lesson that is presented. Yeah, that's a great idea. So you can start thinking about groups that you're in or adult allies that you're connected with who can help you sort of get in at your school to talk about lessons or presentations, or talk about meetings that you can have, or talk about policy changes that can happen at the school to make everybody more comfortable. Yeah, absolutely. Everybody's feedback is really, really helpful and awesome. What about something that we can do on our own? Something that we can do to further educate ourselves? Ask for open conversations with people. That's a great idea. That's a great idea. Yeah. Another great idea that I've heard recently in terms of things that we can do as individuals is practice saying pronouns that you're not used to. And it might feel a little bit silly to practice, but it can really help you feel like it's, so it can be hard to start using a word that you haven't used before, but it's really important that you get people's pronouns correct. So if it's something that you haven't heard before or haven't used a lot, then it's absolutely something you can do to practice it. And there is a website. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, Jen said we can talk to folks who are part of the community on what they need to feel safe and affirmed. Absolutely. Absolutely. Especially for the community of LGBTQ survivors. That's something that, like, folks are the expert on their own experience. And if you haven't had that experience, then there might be things that you haven't thought about that might be ways that you can help support. Or there might be ways that maybe you had really good intentions and you had an idea that later you find out maybe actually wasn't as helpful as you thought it was. And that's okay. But when you talk to folks who are part of the community, that's how you can get those answers. Yeah. So Ms. Farah said, oh yes, a friend of mine kept saying they, referring to the person she's dating. So I was intentional about returning they in the conversation. So listen, people will tell you what they want and need. That's absolutely true. And I had a couple, I'm really liking this conversation, so I think I'm not going to go through these additional slides, but I had a couple of slides about, about reflecting people's language back to them. So in cases that you don't know, you can always wait for people to use a word to describe their identity or their experience rather than assuming. Like, I'm sure that everybody has heard someone say, like, do you have a boyfriend? You know, who's your boyfriend? And rather than doing that kind of thing, we can use language that doesn't assume someone's sexuality or gender identity. So what Vera's talking about is mirroring language. So when someone says they, you can keep saying they back to them. Yeah, something like, who's your significant other? Or are you dating? Or are, things like that. I'm going to scroll up to make sure that I didn't miss anything. Yeah. Another thing that you can do, that you can practice, I'm a big fan of practicing, is ways that you can share your knowledge with other people. So if you've ever been in a group of people and you know that someone is out and that their pronouns are they, them, and theirs, there might be someone who mistakenly uses the wrong pronoun for that person. So if you check in with that person and they want you to sort of help them communicate that to people, then something that you can do is just like gently correct someone and say like, actually it's they, them. And you don't, if you yourself get corrected, you don't have to dwell on it and make a big deal out of it, but make sure that you then correct that and then get it right in the future. And probably apologize. What about like barriers that you might come across if you are trying to make change at your school or in your groups? Yeah, Samantha said acknowledgement is the first step to fixing a mistake. Absolutely. And it also shows that you take it seriously and that you respect that person. Has anybody tried to work to get a group together or work to create a change and experienced some barriers or some slowdowns? Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Administration normally doesn't want to make a change, even if they say they want to. That's a big one. I've been trying to work with administration for my project and they've done almost nothing to help me. Yeah, first of all, I'm sorry that that's happening. That's really frustrating. And I think that's something that a lot of folks doing work at schools have come across, because there might be people who are like, well, this is the way that we've always done things, and it's always been fine, which we know isn't necessarily true, even if no one has told them about it. So that's tough. Does anybody have any suggestions for something like that? The only thing I can think of is try to see if you can loop in some like teachers that are on the same page as you, or other kind of adult allies that can push for that. But that's really tough. Does anybody have any suggestions? Thanks, y'all. Yeah, bringing in outside people who can support you and show how important these conversations and changes can be. Yeah, that's awesome feedback. Yeah, press forward until they yield. Yeah, keep going, Aiden. Mm-hmm. Let's see. And Vera's also said, I have not, but I think religion is definitely a barrier. Yeah, in some cases, religion definitely can be a barrier, and it can be tough to work around that, because sometimes it's really, really deeply important to people. But I also know that there are churches that are really affirming. So getting involved in that kind of community might be a good space to brainstorm making changes in religious communities. Yeah, these are great ideas, y'all. I think we only have 1 minute left. And I am enjoying all of this brainstorming with y'all. Just to make sure that we're being respectful of everybody's time, I'm just gonna go to the last slide, which has my contact information. And if this is something that y'all want to keep talking about, especially you, Aiden, if you want to reach out and have like a one-on-one conversation about your project, I'm happy to do that. I'm super excited that you're doing a project about this. So yeah, you can just contact me later.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Mary, for this amazing workshop. That was really great. So educational. And Aiden, yes, don't give up, because trust me, all of us have been where you are currently at with dealing with, administrative pushback on, making the world a little more inclusive, but times are changing. So don't give up hope just yet. We are going to everyone, please say thank you to Mary, our lovely, lovely social worker from ABLF, for this amazing PowerPoint today. We are going to take a really quick break. So go to the bathroom, drink some water, stretch a little bit. And teens, we will see you back on the stage around 1:05. And parents, just stay here in sessions and you'll see the GCAP parent workshop workup pop up. And we're also going to start that over at 1:05. So thank you guys so much and enjoy your mini break.